Thank you guys for being here. Our class is called I Will. If you've been here for quite a while, you've heard my intro to it a few times now, but if this is your first time or one of your first times, the theme for this class is basically how to develop character traits of an outwardly focused Christian, and it's based off of a book by Tom Rainer. So every week we take one of his book chapters and expand it into a class. Last week the topic was I will give generously, and we talked about how important it is for all of us to take the blessings that we have received from God and having the kind of heart that's willing to share those blessings with others, to pay it forward. There's something that happens in us when we receive over and over and over and over, but never develop the capacity to give back. There's an attitude shift. There's something that happens in our relationship with God and in our relationship with others where those who receive but never give kind of develop a self-centered attitude, selfishness, and that lack of giving ends up being a real challenge in our faith. It can be really detrimental to our relationship with God. So when we give, there's the benefit of the people we give to, they receive something, but then there's the benefit to us too, because giving is good for our souls. Today, though, the topic is, again, this is from Tom Rainer's book. I'm not sure I would have come up with this on my own as a trait for an outwardly focused Christian, but it is pretty interesting. Chapter 7 is, I will not be a church dropout. I will not be a church dropout. And the goal that I kind of distilled from that chapter, so you read the chapter and you think, okay, so that's what I'm not supposed to do. What should I be doing instead? I think the goal that he's discussing is to stay faithful in our commitment to the local church, our local congregation, by avoiding both burnout on the one hand and atrophy on another. Now, atrophy is a medical term, right? Atrophy is when you don't use a muscle for so long that it actually gets weak and you lose the ability to use that muscle because it's just been, I don't know, you haven't been using it and it just sort of deteriorates. So the goal would be for us to stay committed in our church relationships, committed to the local congregation by avoiding burnout and avoiding atrophy, or maybe apathy could be another word for that too. And I just want to say good morning to Avery in the back. Avery, good morning. Good to see you. Thanks for coming to class today. All right, so what we're talking about, what this chapter is talking about is there's a metaphor we can use, and you could say this chapter is about closing the back door of church. What do you guys think that means? Closing the back door of church in this context of not being a church dropout. Where do you think we're going to go with this metaphor? Jeff?
Don't make it easy for people to just pick up and leave.
Don't make it easy for people to pick up and leave. Armed guards at the door. You're not leaving this place. Like, not exactly like that. I know what you do. I know what you mean, though. Yeah. It just sounds a little interesting sometimes.
Pay attention and notice when someone hasn't been there for a while.
Okay, yeah, we're going to pay attention. We're going to notice if people that have been coming consistently are suddenly absent, they're gone, we haven't seen them for a while. You want to check in on them and see, how's it going? Are you okay? Do you need something? Has something gone wrong? Right? Yeah. Victor?
Yeah, and it's again what I always talk about, Bryan, with the relationship building, and that as a foundation for your organization. And any organization, whether it's your family, the church, your work, your team that you're on, is people, once you build those relationships, it's harder to just drop everything and just take off.
Yeah.
And that's not why you build relationships, but again, people need to know that you love them and that you're concerned for them and that they have somebody that they can turn to.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about that in this class about when times get rough, that's when you need not only God, but you need other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey guys, it's Bryan. Just a quick interruption. At this point in the class, there was a really good comment about one reason that people sometimes walk out the back door is because they come to church and there's conflict in the relationships, and that conflict isn't resolved in a very healthy or Christ-like way. I tried to pick that up on the original recording. It was just a little tough to hear, but that was the comment, and here's what happened next. Yeah, Max Lucado says conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. So there is going to be conflict in every relationship, including within the church, but it doesn't have to be combat. Some people are so conflict avoidant, like myself, where when something rough does happen, they withdraw and they never address it. And so that's just equally as damaging if you never actually work through the problem, or if you turn it into all-out combat. Both of those are going to be pretty rough on the relationship. So there is a way of handling conflict in a way that is healthy, Christ-centered, and moves towards healing. And I think you've identified something really important. Vaughn.
What are some reasons or what are some causes that would cause a person to drop out?
That's a great question. We're going to talk all about that today, Vaughn. What a great lead into that. So we will address that. Before we get quite down that road, though, I just want to identify or talk a little bit about what Tom Rainer, why he brings up this idea being a church dropout. And what he has noticed in churches is that churches can be really evangelistic and good at outreach and really good, maybe even at sort of marketing and getting people to come. But what he noticed is that there's a pretty sizable group of people that start going to a church, and they might even get plugged in, and they might even be pretty active. But then after a certain amount of time, maybe it's a period of months or maybe it's a period of years, those same people who came to that church with a lot of enthusiasm will sort of walk out the metaphorical back door. They'll drift away from church, and it's either they switch churches or they just stop going to church in general. And so it can be a sudden departure or sort of a slow drift out the door. But there's this phenomenon where people show up with a lot of enthusiasm, and then they end up walking away. And Tom Rainer wants to know, why does that happen? He tries to identify some of the reasons why. So we'll talk about that in a second. But Amy, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, it just made me think of you talking about people's attitude when you're doing all the taking, or I think sometimes people come in gung-ho and they feel like they're doing all the giving and they feel entitled to, you have to agree with me and make the decision I want you to make. And then when you don't, I get mad. And then it's kind of a lack of conflict resolution, so I pick up my toys and go home.
Yeah, that could be it. I feel like I've earned the right to get things sort of my way or to receive because I've given so much, and don't you know how much I've sacrificed? And then you realize that all the good they were doing, there was sort of a string attached to it, even if it was unspoken. So some of the typical reasons, and you can even picture a shepherd with their sheep. Shepherd's in charge of 100 sheep, and they're out in the pasture, and they're eating, and everything's great, but then the shepherd notices a wolf in the vicinity. The shepherd starts to call in all of the sheep into the sheep pen through the front door, so that they can be safe, right? But if there was some sort of back door or exit out the side that the shepherd didn't know about, then the sheep who are coming in the front might be wandering out the back just as fast as they're coming in. And so it's great that they're coming in out of danger, but if they're able to escape out the back, they're kind of back out where that wolf is anyway. That doesn't actually help. So you kind of want to close that back door and identify the reasons people are walking away, and then try and address it. So Tom Rainer talks mostly about two things. They burn out from doing too much. They never really get plugged in to begin with. They never actually start serving. Another one that he doesn't talk about would be younger people who grow up in the church, and they come because mom and dad drive them and make them. And then when they hit college, they graduate from high school and they graduate from church simultaneously. So they grow up, they move out, and they move on from their involvement in church. And that's a pretty common trend for people who enter young adulthood, 20s into their 30s. What other reasons might you add to why people might start going to a church with a lot of enthusiasm, but then either suddenly leave or slowly drift away? We've burning out, not getting plugged in, just life changes like you head off to college. Amy?
Excuse me. It's like that previous chapter where we talked about the reason for coming to church. Are you coming to worship God, or are you coming for you to get filled?
Sure.
I think sometimes people are coming for them to get filled, and so then it's easier to drift away.
Yeah.
Feel like they are no longer being fulfilled.
Okay, yeah. Eric, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was just thinking, a lot of times people come to church and we get so engulfed with the traditional way we worship God in church that we don't have a real personal relationship with Him.
Okay, so our involvement in church or our relationship with God is based off of more routine and ritual rather than a deep personal connection. Okay, yeah, I could see that. Jane?
Somebody comes in with a new idea
Oh, yeah.
and it's automatically knocked down and kicked out the door, so there goes the person with the idea.
Yeah, for sure. I've got ideas, and I see that from both sides. So someone shows up with new ideas, and it's like, okay, wait a second. That's not how we do things here.
Exactly.
And so
And
if...
I'm in charge, you're not.
Yeah, if the idea wins and you implement that, then the people who resisted it or were uncomfortable with it, they might say, well, I'm going to go to a church where we're not doing that kind of stuff. But then if the idea is presented and it's not adopted, then they're like, well, I can't do anything here. I'm going to go find a different church. No, in the back, go ahead.
Two ways that I've seen. One is a new Christian comes in, and for a long time the church I grew up in was a fire hell, fire and brimstone kind of church. You do this, you're going to go to hell. You do this, you're going to go to hell. Kind of a shock to the system when you're a Christian and you look at yourself, you're like, I'm doing all these things, and there doesn't seem like any hope or any like salvation or any kind of like grace in there where you're just thrown straight into, unless you do your life perfectly, you're going to go to hell. And that people get discouraged and they leave after that. Another way that I've seen is, even if someone is doing something wrong, like for example, we had some members that got divorced and got remarried, and not scripturally. People of the church, elders of the church, it never came across that with grace or with love. It was you are doing sin, you are doing wrong, you are going to hell. And it was just a very... They were scripturally factual, they're correct, but they didn't do it in a loving manner.
Yeah. So just the way that we try to communicate truth, or the way we try to motivate people to do what is scriptural, can come across as overly harsh or judgmental or controlling, and that can kind of turn people off. Yeah. So even if it's true, the way it's presented might lack grace and drive people away. Vaughn?
Where does it say in the Bible that I need to go to church? Why can't I sit at home, read the Bible, study there, and have my relationship with God?
Because we're still getting to know each other, do you mind if I ask, is that a rhetorical question, or is that like a real where in the Bible question?
No, I'm serious.
Okay, so yeah, and I apologize for just having to clarify that. But I would say Hebrews chapter 10 talks about let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. And then you just look at Acts chapter 2, the depiction of the early church that they gathered together every day, meeting in each other's homes, meeting in the temple, worshiping God, enjoying fellowship, building great relationships with the community. And there's quite a few other places that you could turn to. And I mean, staying at home and reading the Bible and praying is good, but you're missing another part of the life of a disciple, which is the community, the relationship aspect. I mean,
The one another life.
yeah, the one another. Yeah, just you could search for one another in your Bible app or on BibleGateway.com and see all the relationship type of stuff. Yeah, Martha.
But we grow when we help others. And so our responsibility is to be here to not only get recharged ourselves, but to help those who need that.
Yeah, yeah.
Believe me, when I see all of you here, it really recharges my battery.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a lack of relationship, maybe just the way that truth is being communicated, the attitude of the individual Christian. Maybe a couple more and then we'll move on. How about Joan and then Victor? 1, 2.
I've heard this many times. Nobody talked to me. Nobody greeted me. Nobody was friendly, that kind of thing. And so they just walked away.
Yeah, you show up, which could be a huge step for you, like someone who's had a complicated relationship with church. They've kind of had their past experiences. They finally say, okay, I'm going to go. I'm going to give it a try. They show up. They're ignored or they're neglected. Or even worse, you're there and it's like, you're in my seat. Can you move, please? That's where I sit. And so you show up, you feel like you're a problem. You're infringing on someone else's rights or their space. And you realize, okay, I made a mistake by coming here today, because if this is how God's people are going to treat me, I'm not sure I really want to be associated with the God that they claim to worship, right? So that's, how we treat people makes a big difference. Victor.
Bad things happen to good people. In other words, bad things happen, and they're like, why did God let my house get destroyed by the tornado? Why is my spouse passing away in front of me? Why, whatever. My child died. We can go on and on. I've seen it happen where they might not leave right away, but that starts to eat at them, and then eventually they're gone. Probably for good from any church.
That can cause a crisis of faith, and it causes you to doubt God's goodness. It's very disorienting, especially for those who have been faithful and loyal and committed and have sacrificed greatly for God and for the church. And then for that tragedy to happen to them, it's like, wait a minute, God, why would you allow that to happen? And it causes you to doubt God's goodness and his grace, and it can be really hard to keep going to church and keep worshiping God and singing the praise songs when you feel like, but God, you haven't been there for me. So yeah, that could definitely happen. I think that's why we need community and relationships to be able to process that and work through that. And it's never, those people aren't going to be able to say something that magically fixes the pain or fixes the problem, but they'll be able to carry the burden with you. Connie?
We've seen over the years, some people are just there for the programs, basically. You don't necessarily know that at the time, but we had a great youth group, and the parents were there, and they were always there, and everything was great. We had all these families, and once the kids were done with school, then the parents left too. So it was just something, they were there basically for that association and that program until their kids didn't need it anymore.
That's almost the opposite of like kids who come because their parents make them. It's parents who come because they want their kids to have a good kids program. So if that child graduates or whatever, or if for whatever reason they don't feel connected to that church, kids program, youth group, then once the kids kind of detach, the parents detach too, because that was the whole reason to begin with. There was nothing personal for them, yeah. All right, well, like I said, he talks about burnout being one where you just do so much that like you're constantly volunteering at every event. You're on the committee for every ministry. You're doing things every Sunday. You are leading communion. You are praying. You are teaching. You are cleaning bathrooms. It's like all of it. And anyone who asks for a volunteer, you're like, I'll do it. I will. Which is great to have that attitude. But sometimes a person commits to so much that their relationship with God can't sustain all of the activity they're doing for God. And they get tired. They get burned out. And sometimes it's not that they feel the need to volunteer for everything. It's more like they look around and they realize no one else is volunteering for anything. If we want this church to do anything, it's going to have to be me because we have far too many spectators and not enough servants here. So I feel like I have to step up to the plate because no one else is doing anything. So that becomes sort of a seed that grows into bitterness, and then that bitterness can be the cause of someone walking away from church. Basically, no one else is ever going to step up. I'm going to work myself to death if I stay here. And eventually they walk away because they've reached kind of a breaking point in their relationship with God and their involvement in church. But sometimes it is overcommitting specifically to kind of please people and win people's favor and to feel needed. And I don't think we talk about that enough, that sometimes when we agree to do good things, part of what's driving us is the need to feel needed and appreciated and valued, where sometimes people who don't do anything at all, if they were to stand still, and if they were to take a break from all of the activity, and if they were just to be alone with their thoughts and with God, they really wouldn't like the person that they are. They would feel very uncomfortable with looking in the mirror. So to avoid the pain of introspection and spending quiet time alone with God, where they'd have to confront their own immaturity and sinfulness and pride, they just stay busy doing all kinds of good things. Because if I'm busy doing good things for God, I must be a good person. So the activity for God becomes a way for them to avoid the unhealthy things that lurk beneath the surface. I don't think we talk about that enough. And then I did talk about this one. There's too many spectators, so those who are willing to serve, there's just far too much on their plate. The other cause could be atrophy, where you show up at church, you never get plugged in, you never volunteer, you never get part of a small group. You just kind of show up and you realize, I could be gone from this church for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks in a row, and nothing would change, and no one would notice me, and nothing would suffer. And if nothing would change from me not being there, why bother? Right? So people never get plugged in, and they kind of end up walking away for that reason. Now, the passage that Tom Rainer talks about that addresses both of these, he says, is Ephesians 2, 8 through 10. So he says that in one way, this talks to Christians who are leaning more towards burnout, who are doing way too much, specifically because they feel the need to do good things to earn God's approval or to earn other people's approval. And he also says it speaks to Christians who are a little bit inactive in their faith because it calls us to do great things for God. So this could help, balance people out who might fall on both sides of that spectrum. Ephesians 2, 8 through 10 says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. Not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." I want you to put on, think along the lines of a Christian who is almost burning out. The one who says yes to every volunteer opportunity, who's constantly busy, constantly going, constantly doing. How would this verse help balance you out towards a healthier attitude about your faith and your actions?
You might be the one to encourage others to step in.
Okay, you might take all of your enthusiasm, and instead of focusing that on doing the work, you could transition it towards encouraging others to step up. That's a great application of that. Training others, recruiting, training others, for sure, How else might this speak to Christians who are leaning towards burnout?
Well, we have to remind ourselves constantly, I'm not worthy.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing I can do can earn my salvation, nothing.
Yeah, nothing I can do to earn, there's nothing I can do to earn my salvation. We're not saved by what we do. We're saved by God's grace. Jeff?
Each of us has a purpose.
Yeah, each of us has a purpose. There's something that we are being called to do. If you're already doing a ton of things, though, then maybe what you need to hear is that you're not saved by what you do, and you don't earn God's love from what you do. So you don't need to constantly be busy in order for God to have a favorable view of you. You don't need to constantly be doing all of these good things in order for God to be proud of you. He's already saved you by His grace. So that kind of balances out that perspective. I think the other side is a little bit easier to see from this verse, the one who isn't doing much at all, because, verse 10, I put this one in bold, that we are created to do good works. There are good things that God is calling us to do. If you aren't really serving or encouraging or being active in your faith, this verse should be a little bit convicting, that there are good things that God is calling us to do. It's not everyone is called to do the same things, but we're all called to do good things in our context. So I think I kind of see where Tom Rainer is coming from here on how this could balance out both of those perspectives, although I hear the part about speaking to inactive Christians a little bit more loudly than the other one about speaking to Christians who are burning out. Although I get his point that if you're burning out because you're trying to earn God's favor, I see how this would definitely come into play there.
Brian, can I address that?
Sure.
Because I experienced that in Loveland. I was getting burnt out.
Yeah.
And it wasn't because I wanted to do good works to check off the list. It was because nobody else was doing
Yeah.
what needed to be done. And, how I eventually had to look at it, and I look at it the same way today, is you have to take care of yourself mentally. You just have to. Because if you get burnt out and quit, then nothing is going to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so you have to be able to say no, and at some point, and try to create that balance with the good works, and as Connie said, training people or encouraging others to do it. Or sometimes I just said, I can't do this. I told the elders, look, you got to find somebody else for the next 6 months because I need to step back.
Yep.
I didn't leave. That was never my intention, but you have to take care of that.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to develop some healthy boundaries on our time and what we're willing to do. It's great that you were wanting and willing to serve. I think you were wise to recognize I've got certain limits here, and I can't do everything that other people want me to do and still have a great family life, a strong relationship with God, to be healthy mentally and emotionally. And you do have to take care of yourself without making it all about yourself.
Right.
So much of Christianity is balance, right? Just finding that balance.
Bryan, just to add to that.
Yeah.
One of the things that, and I'm a people pleaser, so it's really hard for me, and it seems like you go in a church setting, and you can please people, and you're doing it for God, right? So it's kind of a hard balance to maintain. But I think one of the things that helps me is I have to step back sometimes and ask myself, am I pleasing people or am I pleasing God?
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that we're putting God on the throne and not other people.
Yeah.
And I don't think you necessarily are doing it because you're trying to earn your way, but you kind of are in a way because you are trying to please people, and that's what gives you some good feelings.
Yeah. Absolutely. Amy. Oh, sorry. Were you?
But that's what I would say, is always try to keep some perspective, kind of like Victor was talking. You need to make sure that you're actually trying to please God and do the things God wants you to do, and not necessarily doing things for people. Sometimes it'll be good, and sometimes you could actually not be helping them because you're fulfilling needs that might be a bad path for them.
Yeah.
So.
The learning boundaries is so important because the unspoken message as you grow up in the church is that you're not allowed to say no.
And you're a pretty selfish or immature person if you say no, right? And then people kind of learn that guilt tripping can be a pretty effective tool, right? And that's kind of goes into like the sinners in the hands of an angry God. Like if you can't motivate people with love and a compelling vision for who they can be in Christ, then one way to motivate them is just to scare them into submission or to guilt them into submission. And although that might get you the results that you want in the short term, it's very unhealthy in the long term to try and guilt people to Jesus or scare them to Jesus, basically. So, the metaphor that he uses in the book is, he says, are you a comet Christian? He says people who come in and they're really enthusiastic and they burn really brightly for a short time are comet Christians. It's like that comet in the sky. It looks awesome, like, wow, that's amazing, but it doesn't last. And that's the big difference between a comet and, say, the moon or the stars or the sun, which are also lights in the sky. The difference being those are consistent. And even a star, it's not as bright as the sun because it's so far away. It might not be as bright, but it's there every night and it's consistent. And so sometimes Christians come in, they're really enthusiastic, they work really hard, they do so many amazing things for God, but they're doing too much too fast and it's not sustainable. So they end up burning out and walking out the back door just as fast as they came in. And Max Lucado talks about this idea of getting burned out in his book, Help Is Here, about the Holy Spirit. He says, God does not want a bunch of stressed out, worn out, done in, and washed up children representing him in the world. He wants us to be fresher day by day, hour by hour. And he says the Holy Spirit can help us with that, but so can slowing down, setting limits, setting boundaries, and not overworking ourselves. So that's speaking mostly to those who are burning out. I think some of us probably struggle with the opposite, which would be, atrophy. But let me just talk a little bit more about burnout and how sometimes the answer is doing less, but sometimes the answer is just investing more time in our relationship with God to be able to sustain the work. And I want to talk about Olympic athletes a little bit since we've got the Olympics coming up. And I mentioned the Olympics a little earlier in the summer too, for one of the lessons. But have you ever heard about the kinds of things Olympic athletes eat in order to train and get into shape for the events that they do? I remember hearing when Michael Phelps was still at the top of his game, like 15 years ago or whatever, when he was like setting world records every time he got into the pool. He did some interviews and he started telling people what his diet was like to get into shape like that. And this guy was eating like between 8,000 and 10,000 calories a day in order to get ready for that. And the average would be more like 2,000. And he would like show everyone like this feast that could feed a group like that. And he's like, oh yeah, that's my lunch, right? Like he was eating all of this. So think about this principle. He was working harder in that pool than most of us work like in a whole month. Like So much energy is being exerted in that pool. So much energy is being exerted to train, to lift weights, to run, to swim. He's got to be at the top of his game. The output is staggering. But when the output is so high, then you need the input to match it, right? So if you're going to go out and work that hard, you need to have the sustenance to maintain it. All right, so just think about that from a Christian point of view now. If you want to go out and be the Michael Phelps of church and work really, really hard and set world records for your service, no one is going to say that's a bad thing, but we are going to say, do you have the kind of strong relationship with God, devotional time with the Lord that can help you sustain that? Because if you're trying to do all of that work without the relationship with God and relationship with others that can fuel you, then you're going to end up burning out. And no one wants to see a highly gifted, talented, spirit-led individual burn out because they're trying to do too much compared to their devotional life with God. So Peter Scazzaro has a book called The Emotionally Healthy Leader. And he says, emotionally unhealthy leaders do more activity for God than their relationship with God can sustain. So that's the principle we're talking about. Jeff.
Paul talked about this, about running the race, finishing well. I mean, if you think about it, prior to his conversion, he was a zealot. He was that comet, not Christian obviously, but he was burning bright for what he thought was right. And then he had to learn through many, many trials along his way to, one, maintain that relationship with the Spirit, but also sometimes to be patient on God. Think about how many times he was in prison, and he could have just, okay, God's done with me, or I'm not good enough, and give up. But he talks about how we are all on a marathon, and there are things we do, eating 10,000 calories a day to fuel us. But we also have to be looking at the long game and not just 2 steps in front of us.
Yeah. Here's one more thought, and this speaks a little bit more towards Christians who are closer to atrophy. Imagine that you constantly eat 10,000 calories a day, but you're not an Olympic swimmer, and you don't put out that output. You don't train. There's going to be some couch potato Christians who constantly come to church and they're fed over and over and over and over again, but they never do any work with it. Okay, so there can be the opposite side of this too, where we have all the nutrition that we need, all the spiritual food that we need, but we're not actually doing anything with it. And that would be more like atrophy, where you have those muscles, but you're not using them. So for the last couple minutes of class here, I want to talk a little bit about, we've talked about Christians who drop out, Christians who walk out the back door. When I was going to seminary, one of the biggest things that we talked about with respect to youth ministry was, why are so many kids growing up in youth group, graduating from high school, and then leaving church altogether when they go off to college? Like, what is happening with that? It could even be high school students that made a really clear commitment to Christ. They were the leaders in the youth group. Like, it seems like even the best and brightest, if you want to call that, like the most promising, kids, they'll grow up, and a huge, majority of them end up walking away from the faith. So we were just trying to figure out, what is going on with that. There's been several studies and several books and several things kind of put out there that helps explain that. But the research that I really like to focus on is, well, what about the young adults who stayed? What about the high school kids who graduated, they went to college, they stayed committed to Christ, they were faithful in college, they stayed faithful to their congregations as they went through their 20s and 30s? Like, what was so different about them that helped them sort of break the trend? So I'll share with you really, really short and sweet summaries of a couple books that talk about this question. One of them is called Faith for Exiles by David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock. David Kinnaman is the president of Barna Research Group. And so they identified that young adults, maybe about 10% of them who grew up in church stayed what they called resilient disciples when they were in their 20s. And they did a ton of research and studies, and they tried to identify, what do these resilient disciples, those who grew up in church, graduated, but stayed, what do they tend to have in common? And there were kind of 4 things that they identified. One had to do with their theology, what they believed about the gospel message, that they believed that Jesus died on the cross and was raised to life to conquer sin and death. So you take just the core gospel message, and they believe that. If you don't believe that, why would you stay at church? If the central thing of Christianity is something you don't believe in, you're probably not going to stay. So they all shared a clear sort of conviction of the gospel message. They also all tended to have made a personal decision to follow Jesus. They made that decision for themselves. So it wasn't just, well, I go to Southwest Church of Christ because my parents go to Southwest Church of Christ. I go to church because that's what we've always done in our family. At some point, they made that a personal decision to follow Jesus and not just, I go because my mom and dad make me. The next two are themes that we've talked quite a bit about in our class. They were involved in some kind of small community, a class, a ministry, a support group, something that wasn't just the big church, but they were involved in a small church. So they were involved in a faith community beyond just worship services. And I shared this statistic with you that Christians who are involved in a class or a ministry like that are 5 times more likely to stay involved in church after 5 years compared to Christians who only come to worship services, because the strength of those relationships helps sustain our faith through good times and bad. And then the last thing, which is kind of the whole point of this class, is that they were outwardly focused. They felt that Christianity by default involved them going out into the world to engage the world for Christ. It wasn't just about coming to church and being fed, but they had the sense that Christianity in its nature is about going and having an impact on the world around them. So those 4 things tended to be the common traits of young adults who grew up in church and stayed committed to church when so many of their peers ended up dropping out. There's another book called Growing Young by Kara Powell, Jake Mulder, and Brad Griffin. They are from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. And what they looked at was, the first book was, let's look at the traits of the individual people who stayed committed. This study was more like, let's look at what churches are doing well, churches that are effectively reaching young people and young adults. What do they tend to have in common? So that's a cool sort of balance to the first book too. And they came up with this cool wheel. There's 6 essential strategies or character traits of churches that do a good job of ministering to, engaging, and retaining young people. Probably a little tough to see in the back, so I'll read these for you. The first one is keychain leadership, which is their phrase to say they involved young people in key leadership positions in the church, and they trusted them to lead. They were on committees, they were leading worship. Anywhere that they were looking for adults to lead and serve, it was open to high school kids, college students, young adults too. And they call it keychain because if there was something like I said, I left something in my car that I really need for class today, can someone go get it for me? If I really trusted you, then I'd give you my keys to go out to my car and get my stuff out of there and bring it back to me. If I didn't trust you, I'd say all right, we need to take a 5-minute break from class. Landon, let's go. I'm going to go out to the car with you, and I'm going to lock it for you, and I'm going to watch you get it out of my car and make sure you put you close the door, and then we're going to walk back together because I don't trust you. And I'm kind of giving you a job, but I am totally insulting you the whole way that we do that. And sometimes we do that with young people and say, okay, you can read this Bible verse, but it has to be this translation of the Bible, and you need to practice it 5 times in front of me, and if you mess up, then you don't get to do it again, right? And so it's like we're keychain leadership is saying, here's my keys. Let's do this thing, right? Empathy today, just showing tons of empathy and understanding towards younger people, taking Jesus's message seriously instead of just sort of talking about it as theories, cultivating warm relationships, prioritizing young people, and then being the best neighbors, like literally ministering to the people in your neighborhood. Churches that did that well tend to be the churches that reached out to young people, kept them involved, and engaged them pretty effectively. So those 2 books, I think, kind of paint a pretty cool picture of what we can be aiming for in helping our young people stay committed to the church. Now it's 9:45, so we got to end here. Is there like a short and sweet version of this comment that you can make? All right, go ahead. Yeah.
I grew up in a family of Christians, which is an odd thing. All 3 of my dad and my uncles were both elders. All 3 of them were elders. And I kind of slid away a little bit in college, but that foundation And all of them were involved in their churches. And I saw that, and I wanted that.
Yeah. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. All right, Jeff, final word.
Just go back 2 slides.
Okay.
For
This one?
right there.
Yeah.
How we do number 3 can enhance or detract from the other in 1, 2, and 4.
Oh, sure. Yeah. How we go about community, right, can impact everything else. Yeah, I agree with that completely. All right, next week we're going to talk about a book called Anatomy of a Revived Church. It's sort of a continuation of the book Autopsy of a Deceased Church. That's what went wrong. The next book is Churches That Revitalize After Starting a Period of Decline. What did they do right that helped them sort of reverse course and be healthy and successful again into the future? So we'll talk about that next week. Looking forward to that time together. Thank you guys for coming.